Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Leonor Sierra. I'm the Director of Communications and Engagement at Connecting Genetics to Climate. And apologies, I thought I had muted my sound, and I have not. I'm going to try this once more because it's otherwise going to really annoy me. In theory, the sound isn't on. Okay, I'll keep trying. Connecting genetics to climate was and apologies for my voice today as well. I'm just woke up with the worst congestion on the with the bad timing. But we're here to generate and support and inform public dialogue about existing and emerging genetic technologies that have climate applications. We were founded by Dr. Ting Wu, who is a professor in the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School, where we are located. And really, we have seen the potential for genetics and biotechnology to play a role in addressing climate challenges. Genetics can help identify, match, and also tweak properties of organisms in a way that could have applications for, from capturing carbon to nitrogen fixation in roots, and for lots of other things that maybe go even a little bit beyond climate, but to adapt and mitigate some of its impacts. This webinar is the first of what we're planning as a series to really have a space for people to come together to kind of really discuss this topic intersection, to learn more from others in the field. And today we're really kind of taking a broad overview of the landscape of climate biotech. Our next one will be probably in early December. We'll be looking at the regulatory landscape. And then from then on, we're planning some deeper dive into some of the technologies. Because I think it sometimes can be quite surprising for people to learn that just how many technologies are under development and how many are already deployed. And at Connecting Genetics to Climate, we think that it is up to all of us to decide how, when, and what we want to deploy. So it is really important to be able to have these conversations publicly and openly and really bring some kind of, both scrutiny but also transparency to all this process. Morgan is going to share just an example slide of some of the technologies we've been kind of trying to learn about. And some of them, the ones with the asterisk, are already deployed at this point in time. So these are already being used. But as you can see there, from trees that for enhanced capture carbon, there's some down the road from me here. I live in Georgia, and there's some of those down the road from me. Soil microbes for nitrogen fixation, those are already being deployed, and there's many others that have much that is still much more longer timeline in the deployment, but could all have a potential, and we need to be able to have a conversation about what does deployment look like? What does it need to be able to deploy this and to invest in these kinds of technologies? Who could benefit? Who should have a say? I am delighted to have two great speakers joining me today. So I will briefly introduce them both and then let them basically kind of tell us themselves kind of where they're coming at into this topic, what their background is, and some of the questions or challenges that they see in the field and some of the things that make them excited. So first up, we have Paul Reginato. He's the co-founder and science director of Homeworld Collective. And joining him today is Nazish Jeffery, who is the Bioeconomy Policy Manager at the Federation for American Scientists. So yeah, they're going to start by giving us a little bit of a broad introduction, both to how they're coming at it and into this topic. Paul, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Leonor and Morgan, for having me on here. I'll do my best to give an overview, although I see people in the audience here who know a lot more about specific applications than I do, and maybe they can chime in at some point. So a bit about me, I got into biology because I love living things. I'm a biophile, and that sort of led me to a PhD at MIT in biological engineering, where I was developing tools for biological measurement, really to advance foundational biological science in Ed Boyden and George Church's labs. And that work was really contextualized, even though it was foundational biology, really contextualized by human health. And that, that's very important application. But partway through my PhD, I had this personal reckoning, like when am I going to be applying my talents to what really motivates me, which again is this love for living things. And I wanted to apply myself to climate and sustainability. And with my co-founder Dan, who had sort of his own kind of personal reckoning, we began exploring how biotech could be applied to climate and sustainability. Um, and that sort of recognizing the exciting potential of climate biotech, but also some of the challenges that the climate biotech community faces is really what led us to start Homeworld Collective. And there's applications of biotech that that you mentioned, like that are sort of closer to the horizon, like applications in agriculture, also in chemicals manufacturing, and there are other ones that are a little further off, um, like an increased application of biotech in mining, um, or greenhouse gas removal. Methane is a really exciting emerging area where biotech seems to be one of the major options. And then there's, challenges um, like handling invasive species to help stabilize ecosystems during the course of climate stresses, which is even farther out, but that's such an intrinsically biological problem. It's hard for me to imagine any non-biological solution to that. Um, but at the same time, the climate biotech ecosystem doesn't have the same kind of support and momentum that the medical biotech ecosystem has. And I think that really has to do with just what we've chosen to prioritize in the past as we've funded biology and biotech research. Human health has really been the focus, and that's not only been the focus of funding, but of course of education as well. And so most people in biotech uh, are much more familiar um, with human health challenges than they are with climate and sustainability challenges. And so finding the right problem to work on can be really challenging for people. The other thing is just the support for companies and the playbook for success. It just isn't as built out for climate and sustainability. And so, we can talk more about all those things later, but I think those are the reasons, why climate biotech is exciting, but why it also has some challenges right now, and also why we started Homeworld Collective, my co-founder Dan Goodwin and I, to try to support the climate biotech community making progress on these challenges.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that. I will hand it over to Ashish to do a little introduction to herself and kind of where she's coming at.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Leonora Morgan. Thank you so much for inviting me today. I really appreciate this topic, and I think it's an extremely important one that's more and more people that need to be brought into this conversation just so that we have a larger community at hand to kind of talk about the issues and find solutions, right? That's ultimately what our goal is to still find solutions. Hi, everybody. My name is Nazish. I'm the Bioeconomy Policy Manager at the Federation of American Scientists. And so I kind of come to this topic a little circularly. So I'm a scientist by training. I have my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology, but my research was looking at epigenetics during blood maturation. And so it's very far, far removed from anything climate or sustainability related. But kind of where my expertise kind of comes in is understanding what the bioeconomy is, and what challenges and what opportunities it presents, especially when you look into the broader sectors that kind of fall into the bioeconomy. One of them being, environmental sustainability. And that's kind of where climate biotech kind of sits into my perspective into this conversation. And so when I think about climate biotech and the challenges that the sector is currently facing, I can kind of see the silos that are being created currently. You have climate biotech people on one side, you have normal pharma biotechnology people on another side, and you have the bioeconomy people being like, how do you connect the two areas together? And so that's a challenge in itself, and it's going to take time, obviously, but it's also going to take a lot of effort from people that are working in the sector to reach out and be a part of these larger conversations that kind of put, all of biotechnology under one bucket. And so having webinars like this is a great way forward into creating these types of communities. And so is Homeworld Collective as well. Happy to be part of that organization as well. And so what really excites me is the possibility of using biotechnology to do really interesting, really cool, and really good things for the environment. There's so much potential and there's so much room for innovation in this field that allows us to really kind of have like everything at our doorstep that we can pursue. But that's also going to create challenges along the same way. We need to have directed funding that kind of helps us understand, these are the main priorities within the United States that we want to face. We haven't established that, right? There isn't clear cut. These are the 5 main climate challenges that we're dealing with. And another interesting thing is that we kind of have different sectors within this as well. When we look at the sustainable aviation fuel side of things, you have that entire industry that's booming, but it connects to climate biotechnology ultimately. But those interconnections and those puzzle pieces aren't necessarily being put together. And so, what my interest level and why I love talking about this is trying to understand, the different viewpoints and trying to understand how can we put these different perspectives together so that we can find an ultimate solution for climate change.
Thanks, Nazish, so much. And before I ask our speaker some questions, I actually want to put out a poll just to get a sense of who is here today. So more just to get a sense of kind of, and you can select more than one. So if you could just select what kind of field or fields you would describe yourselves as, to get a sense of we're here. And once it's done, Morgan will also show it so both the speakers and all of you can see who's here. But first off, maybe when we were speaking the other day, Paul, you talked about like sometimes you want to talk about something that is broader than climate, right? And you talk about planetary health, right? This idea of things that will actually, just as we talk about, biotech for human health, kind of making a planet healthier, which involves, yes, a lot of the capturing carbon for a climate, but also it could be other stuff that leads to more sustainable materials, etc. So within that broader bucket of planetary health, what technologies do you think are likely to have the biggest impact and why? You're muted.
I think it's still an open question where biotech will have the greatest impact. I mean, it's because a lot of the spaces are pretty new. Certainly in agriculture, I think that's quite clear, and that's really already the most advanced area. There's also really exciting opportunity in a circular carbon economy, where we're feeding captured carbon either from the air, from point sources, back into industrial processes to produce chemicals, materials, or food, um, and leveraging, sustainable electricity to reduce that carbon into usable forms rather than using fossil sources. And biology has evolved for millions of years to leverage energy sources to reduce carbon and convert it into a variety of different chemicals and materials. Also with the ability to handle somewhat heterogeneous inputs. And I think biotech has a really big potential there. I mean, the leading company that in producing chemicals from like high volume chemicals from CO2 is LanzaTech, and that's a biotech company. I think in some of the earlier stage areas, biotech in greenhouse gas removal is a really exciting area. And I think in methane removal, which is an even much earlier area than like carbon dioxide removal, the biological approaches really are the ones that are being stressed the most. And there is a recent report from the National Academies on methane removal, and they really highlight biology at the core of most viable methane removal approaches. And I'll do a quick plug. Homeworld Collective has an upcoming funding opportunity at the intersection of biotech and greenhouse gas removal and methane removal is one of our particular areas of interest. So if people are interested in pursuing research in that area, check out our garden grants opportunity or reach out to us.
Can
And
you
then
the method you think is earlier on? And so to get a sense for people, what do you think is earlier on? Like what kind of timeline are we talking about here? For it to actually be
yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, methane removal is really at the early stage where it's like foundational research on what are the mechanisms that we could use, how can we estimate the potential for methane removal, and like how much what are the technoeconomics. So that's like about as early stage as you can get. One that's still at the early stage but not as early would be biomining, where you can use organisms for organisms' evolved ability to dissolve minerals or selectively isolate particular metal ions for their own ability to scavenge nutrients, leverage those to extract metals from lower grade ore, from waste streams, to hopefully enable mining processes that are both more efficient and more sustainable. I mean, I think it really remains to be seen how much biotech can be deployed to those purposes, but there's a lot of exciting potential. At the same time, it's an early stage area because it's leveraging a lot of science that hasn't been historically a focus, like in geobiology has not historically been a focus for biology funding, and so that needs to be built out more. And just connecting the industries of mining to biotech is also like a big challenge there, just to so that everyone can get on board. But yeah, those are a few.
Thanks, Paul. And I mean, I think this last point you were making, it talks a bit to the silos that Nazish was talking about before. And I think I was going to ask you, what are some ways the bioeconomy is adapting to the new technologies in this area? And do you think breaking down the silos is one of these ways?
Question
Yeah.
for me? Oh, sorry.
If you want to answer, Paul, you can take a stab at it
Maybe
first.
Nazish, do you want to kick us off? And then if not, Paul can continue if he wants to add anything.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think, yes, 100%, like breaking down the silos is so, so necessary in order to kind of really bring these communities together. Because in a lot of the conversations that I end up being in, people don't even realize that they're a part of this sector or that sector. And that brings additional problems, right? You don't know what those different sectors are talking about, what they're doing, what the innovations are in that space. And so you can't necessarily apply those innovations into your own sectors when you have that division. And so in order to really kind of like, leverage the bioeconomy and have this innovation be prominent, it's going to take a lot of work from the people that are doing it. A lot of these things are at the foundational stage, right? Like I'd like to say that climate biotech, even though it's been around for such a long time, it's still in its nascency. It doesn't have as much federal funding as it does human health does in comparison. And there's just so many technologies that just are there in the at the lab, but how do we scale those technologies to make it more applicable across the board? And so kind of breaking down the silos and just having like a really large push, a community push to really talk about and like bring the entire value chain into conversations is going to be extremely necessary, especially to leverage the bioeconomy in this conversation. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, certainly breaking down the silos, and I think, the question is how to break down those silos. And I think silos, what we're calling silos are really like, insulated communities of practice that mostly interact with each other, right? And mostly are aware of the same things as each other. And those form in response to problems. And eventually, the sort of accepted group of problems that group of people works on becomes insular enough that it can sort of exist on its own in a functional way. And then when new problems come along that don't fit into a silo, that's when, new groups need to form. And I think we can encourage those silos to break down by being really problem focused. At Homeworld Collective, we try to stress a problem focused culture where together we identify important problems and and discourse to figure out what are the most actionable subproblems to work on. And I think that is a great way to orient people from different disciplines by inviting them together. Okay, we're going to talk about this problem. And if this problem is relevant to you, then you're relevant to this discourse. And then trying to make a space where people from different backgrounds can come together to talk about new problems and facilitate their communication with each other. So that's, that's at least the approach that Homeworld is trying to take.
And obviously, funding very often helps direct these questions as well, right? So I think funding could also be the one that kind of keeps things in different ways. So I would say that, are you seeing an increase availability of funding that allows for people to do that kind of shift and to problem focus as well?
I would say there has been an increase, but I definitely think there needs to be more. I think the challenge of accessing funding is a huge problem for people. Most biology is funded by the National Institutes of Health, which doesn't support climate, and Department of Energy is mostly focused on more developed
Biofuels and that sort of.
yeah, technologies that are at a higher stage of development, and a lot of the climate biotech stuff is earlier stage, and so there isn't a strong funding home for that kind of work. I mean, you have some nonprofits like Homeworld Collective is one. We give small grants to really help at the very earliest stage of an idea to help people de-risk ideas and get them off the ground so that they could then access less risk tolerant forms of funding. You have funders like Carbon Technology Research Fund, CTRF, which specifically funds climate biotech, but I'm not aware really of other funders that are really focusing on climate biotech.
Thanks, Paul. And actually, in a similar vein, apart from funding, obviously, very often we see the issue of regulation sometimes come up. Nazish, do you see the regulatory framework? And we are saying that our next webinar will be around the regulatory landscape. Is this an area where do you see it needing to adapt to an area that is kind of in part emerging, partly is like reusing maybe more established technologies, but there's like also new aspects to it?
Yeah, 100%. So that's a really interesting question because like there's no doubt that regulations need to adapt to the new technologies that are coming on board. But it's also the repurposing of older technologies and utilizing them in different ways. That's also something that needs to be looked at on a regulatory pathway as well. It's a major hurdle. And from my perspective, from when I've talked to the regulatory agencies, a lot of it has to do with, lack of capacity, lack of funding on their own ends to be able to really do the due diligence and understanding these new regulatory pathways that are coming online. And then so in a little bit of a way, it's kind of a cat and mouse game for them where they're trying to stay ahead as much as they can, but there's only so much that they can do with the amount of capacity and funding that they do have. And so that's kind of the reason why we have such long wait times sometimes for these regulatory processes, even though the technology itself looks really promising. So adapting regulatory, like the new framework that's coming out that they're working on currently gives us a lot of hope, right? They're trying to be a little bit more coordinated. They're not saying that it's just one regulatory agency doing it at a time. They're trying to work in tandem together, which makes sense as our technology becomes more intersectional as well. But it's a work in progress, and I think there needs to be like a little bit of like understanding into this as well and giving patience, but also providing support when they need it, and being able to talk to the regulatory agencies in a way that you can help explain the science when they themselves just don't have the capacity to go do that research themselves.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And also, it's not exactly like funding for the basic research, but in this whole kind of economy loop, something we often get asked about is the role that carbon credits play, right? And we see it, for example, Living Carbon is planting trees here to kind of remove carbon from the atmosphere, but it also like it plays into the carbon credit. So how do you see that kind of playing a role, Nazish?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. And I think it's also a great case study on how these different policy levers and these different financial incentives can play a huge role in creating markets and driving the technology forward as well. I think it's been made abundantly clear in this conversation that none of this is cheap or easy. And the federal government has these different methods and methodologies in order to help, ease some of that burden of finance that comes with these large challenges and these large innovations. The carbon credits has its works, right? We've had such boom in this industry as a result of having that financial incentive in place. But that's mostly been, directed through the Department of Energy, which, as Paul has already indicated, they do tend to do with technologies that are a little bit further ahead. So it's just kind of taking that dichotomy of technologies that are further ahead, the carbon credits works for them. How do you then translate that for a little bit more nascent technologies that are more at the foundational base, but still have the ability to leverage? And I really resonate with what Paul was saying earlier about how, you need to have directed questions in order to understand where we need to go. And so, financial incentives can be also a part of that, development of figuring out which questions do we pursue, which questions can we, actually take some time and look into to understand fully and comprehensively.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think this is a question for both of you before I open the floor to some questions from the audience. But uh, it seems to me that, we have seen other technologies come, some go as well, some have been deployed, some have not. So are some things that we can learn from some of the other technologies for addressing climate change that have kind of come through this process? And maybe both of you can give some of your thoughts on that. Paul, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest lesson that we can learn from other technologies is what it takes to scale and what is required to do the research and development to produce a technology that is scalable when you're starting from an early stage. Because when we talk about climate and sustainability, we're really talking about huge scale, and that means you're competing on commodity markets, small percentage points in cost really matter. And um, biotech is not accustomed to thinking that way. Most of us, if we are trained toward medical applications, um, in for the most part in pharma, the R&D is the main cost, and once you have your molecule, then you sort of price that at whatever you want, and then that's what people pay. Whereas that's not at all how it works in commodity markets. And so the technoeconomics of what you're doing really matters. And I think, you know, a lot of people who, are switching into climate applications from medical applications of biotech are learning the word technoeconomics for the first time, where it's, really having to think about not only what's physically possible, but what can scale at what cost and what are those factors. And technoeconomic analysis is its own sophisticated domain of practice. And bringing that into the climate biotech discourse and really having it integrated with the way that people think and the way that people go through um, their business development and their ideation, and the way that we also support companies and vet ideas, that I think is the biggest thing that we can bring in.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah. Nazish, over to you. Sorry.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you're saying right now, Paul. I definitely see like the scale across biotechnology, not just specific to climate biotech, but scale. It's such a big hurdle for people. The cost, the machinery cost alone can sometimes be so significant, and it creates a really significant barrier into the market. In addition to that, I think I think, the technologies that we have today that have been deployed, I think make for great case studies to allow us to look back on them and see, what worked, what didn't work, what did we end up needing as it was being deployed that we didn't realize we needed ahead of time. And a lot of that, I think, also has to do with infrastructure within the United States as well. Do we have CDMOs, CMOs that are, can be translated into more climate biotech applications? Do we have the machinery that we need near the different regions where these different climate challenges are being presented? How do you bring, in terms of agriculture, how do you bring like a biomass that is being produced in Iowa to where you need to actually process it? And so all of these things need to be considered along the way. And if we do it at the forefront of a technology, then when it comes time, we can be prepared, which in a lot of cases we tend not to be sometimes.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And also it seems to me that you kind of like want a technology that has a big impact in some of these cases, right? So like you're asking a technology to be everything very quickly, very early on, because for maybe from carbon capture, for example, you're not interested in capturing small amounts of things. You want like a bigger deal for it to be viable very quickly, right? While some showing that scalability can be hard, I would imagine, right? So we have quite a few questions, and I'm going to try and if there's some that are like related, I will group them. But maybe the first question is who is not here by category or sector, and we have the result of the poll that should have popped up for everyone that needs to be part of this conversation, an emerging community of practice. Obviously, from our point of view, as we feel like we want more people, is we would want to engage the communities where these technologies are being deployed. But obviously for something like this webinar, it's hard to have them here. But who else do you think is missing, Paul Nazish? We have quite a lot of researchers from academia.
I think my guess is who's missing here is people who aren't biologists. Um, my guess is mostly the people on this call are in biology, and I think it's really important to be careful that we're not just kind of like gassing each other up on the potential for biotech when like there's other people out there developing other solutions that aren't biotech that might be better or might just have problems that biotech can address that we don't know about. So this is really where like I think we're still living in a kind of silo. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's really great, Paul. I think for me, when I look at this group of people, or like the groups of people that normally you're talking about this topic, I feel like we miss the people that might actually deploy the technology. So in case of agriculture, the farmers in this case. And then also, different sectors that we may not think about necessarily being like just climate, but for example, the wildfire folks, I think should also be a large part of this conversation. They're thinking about biomass utilization in order to prevent wildfires, soil restoration through microbial introduction. And so they are also a part of this conversation, and they're also nascent. And so they're probably having the same struggles that the climate biotech community is also facing. And so kind of bringing these outside perspectives and these people that actually end up deploying or utilizing the technology is really important to have at these conversations, because that's when you can actually get to the crux of what the true challenges are. It's one thing to say like, it's hard to make a technology be viable, but what does it actually take to make it so that you can use it at a farm somewhere, or if you can introduce it into a forest land in order to prevent wildfires?
Yeah, and we know of some people that are trying to do, like we know that lab to land folks did some work on wildfires and trying to discuss different approaches. So I think those conversations are beginning to happen, definitely. But the question is, how do we keep on having them, right? And we have a question that is actually partly being addressed, but maybe I think it looks a bit to be more to you, Paul, but it's a little bit more about the details about techno-economic analysis that are being done to help identify what is most important or actionable. How do researchers go about kind of like doing these things?
Um, this question might be better addressed by Nazish, or at least I'd love to hear what Nazish has to say as well. But I think I think if you're a researcher, I mean the first thing is just a back of the envelope around what the main components of your technology are and what you expect them to cost at scale. So that, it's going to be your inputs, your energy requirements, um, and the infrastructure that you think you'll need. And a really important consideration is like how efficient you expect your processes to be at scale. That if in the lab you're able to get them to work really efficiently, you might not actually get that kind of efficiency at scale because there's other considerations. Um, like for example, diffusion of oxygen through a fluid can be a limiting factor that isn't present in the lab, to name one. And so I think doing those back of the envelopes for yourself, but then also reaching out to people who are able to tell you about the techno-economics and the challenges of these things at scale, and people who are experienced doing techno-economic analysis. If that isn't in your wheelhouse, find a collaborator.
Yeah, Nash, do you want to add something there as well?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Like, in a lot of these cases, I feel like people like as Paul mentioned, like it might seem efficient in lab, but when the reality comes to scaling it, it definitely is a lot bigger than people tend to expect. But also, I think there's like this interesting perspective within the funding community. Like, as startups kind of go through the process of trying to get funding. Let's be honest here, venture capitalists don't understand how biology really works and the timelines and how, they expect ROIs immediately and science takes its sweet time. And there's no way to rush that. Rushing it is only going to cause more failure down the line. And so it's kind of under having like it's weird. So I like to say it's like this, it's the big tech companies in California now being like, ooh, biology is cool, but they're still putting the same principles of big tech where, software is software. Once you write the code and you make it optimized, it can run. It's not quite the same within biology. And so having those conversations within like, venture capitalists and having government be aiding in the process of like these funding opportunities along the way is going to be extremely essential and crucial alongside the techno-economics that Paul is talking about as well. Because like you have to have those numbers when you go into the conversation. Otherwise, people are going to have a really hard time translating the difference between biotechnology and just like normal tech.
So that's really helpful. And I think this kind of takes us to the next thing, which is some people in the questions are talking about they want to get involved and they have questions, they have maybe some expertise, right? They're maybe at different stages of their career. They might be, a geneticist, or we have someone here who has an experience in plant genetics and metagenomics. And they're asking, how do they start thinking about working in this area? What advice would you have? And in one case, they're asking, can you point them to any startups or companies that are not the usual big ag that are working on microbial restoration approaches? So a little bit specific here, and some broader, like if you have some expertise, so again on the bio side, but you want to kind of like pivot maybe a little bit, which is kind of in a different way what you did, Paul, right?
Um, there's a few dimensions to answering this question. So one, I would say the first thing is just try to become aware of the problems in the spaces that your work can address. And that can mean rabbit holing on things and also reaching out to people who have knowledge in those areas. And when you reach out to people, they're always going to be more excited to talk to you if you've already rabbit holed yourself and you have some interesting nuggets of your own that are like ideas or questions. And don't be afraid to ask those. I think even if they're naive, it shows that you're thinking. And just by thinking through those things and then learning that, oh, you're missing something, that's going to really teach you a lot. Um, Homeworld Collective is also building out tools to support people. So we have a jobs board. So I would encourage you to go and check out our jobs board um, to see if there's anything on there that might apply to you. and also to check out our problem statement repository, which is a collection of open problems in emerging climate biotech areas. And that's that's a repository that we're hoping to grow a lot as time goes on.
And I will say that, as Paul has mentioned, like previously the National Academies report, and then we had the Lab to Lab report, and now this Morgan is putting all these links in the chat, so you can just go there, and all the links are in the chat. Um, so, a different question maybe are, what are some of the kind of like the stories that keep getting told, the case studies that everyone in a certain circle might know, but you think haven't really kind of broken outside the circle for the world at large to hear, as some of the stories that show kind of some of the potential, or some of the lessons that have been learned from some of the case studies that you think have not really permeated into public dialogue? Nazish, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think I might have a harder time answering this question because because of the bioeconomy, I end up thinking about a lot of different sectors and don't have time to like really just focus in on different companies necessarily. But I think what I would want to say is look at the clean energy sector and how the biofuel side of it is really what they are doing and what they have accomplished in this time frame. They've got national goals in place. Like, how amazing would it be if we had national goals for climate biotech in place as well? And so it's kind of like taking what's happening within DOE in the biofuel sector, and how do you translate that into what climate biotech needs? And so it's, obviously it's government support, but it's also these financial incentives that need to be in place. It needs to be having goals in place, and like Paul mentioned before, it's these directed questions to help researchers and help innovation focus on what they need to figure out first in order to like really make impact long term.
Yeah, I would agree that biofuels are a great place to look, and I think looking at the rise and fall of the biofuels boom, a decade and a half ago or so, is really will be really instructive. And also looking at how the story has gone for genetically modified crops, because basically biotech basically lost that fight, right? GMOs have a bad reputation amongst most of the population. And understanding why that is, where there might be merit to those concerns, where those concerns might be overblown and misrepresentative of what GMO technology can actually do, to try to understand how to go about building new technologies in a way that uh, is truly beneficial for society and has and gives society the ability to understand and engage that narrative as truly as possible um, to its actual character.
I will say that with the GMO, as someone, as a European that also worked in the public engagement side of this discussion, I think that a lot of the concerns were not really about the genetic technology, right? It was around big companies, right? It was about the way that companies were deployed. So I think there were a lot of conversations deployed, and I think there is a change, and it's also not a homogeneous discussion the world over, right? So I think it is important to also, when we're talking about locally problem solving, that the where we deploy the technologies, different people will have different concerns. So we can't just blanket assume that we know what the concerns will be. And I think that is important there. Which actually takes us to we have a question about deployment locally. Let me just find that one. About when comparing biological systems to engineering systems, we will always see flaws in the scalability due to the limitations of biological systems and trade-offs that biosystems can adapt and evolve. So what are folks thinking about leveraging these characteristics for, say, locally adapted climate solutions? And I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Is this something, Paul, does that make sense to you?
I'm not sure I understand the question, honestly.
So I think if I understand it correctly, it's really about that is the question, and I'm happy to be checked for in the chat. But I think the answer is that it's going back to this idea that what works in one area might not work in another area because the settings are very different, right? So this would take us back to the kind of working through local problems and not just trying to come up with a biosystem that kind of solves the whole solution, right? And is this even more important, say, in biotech than it might be in some different kinds of technologies, if I understand the question? Is that maybe I think it was Elizabeth, if she could give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to have we lost them? We'll come back to that question. Maybe we can clarify. They were asking us about a major funder and supporter of biotech in Massachusetts has been the Mass Life Sciences Center over the years. But they feel that the new administration has been focusing more on just the silo of climate. Have either of you had any conversations with you to kind of like about engaging more broadly in life sciences to include climate biology?
I'm not sure I have a strong answer to that question.
Okay. We can say that we are going to be having broader conversations with different folks and connecting genetics to climate. So we're keeping a note of that one, but we haven't had those conversations either. We can say that.
I can jump in later. I
Yeah.
don't have an answer for that, unfortunately, but I can say that I think that's a kind of what the crux of the problem is, right? It's like people always keep those two disciplines almost separate, and we need to have that conversation involve both of those disciplines together now. And so having administrations just say that they are continued to be separate is not going to help anybody at all.
Thanks. Thanks for that. And I just had some. I'm trying because Morgan is like the questions are like coming fast, so it's kind of hard to keep through in the chat which questions are coming through. Do you have, in the meantime, any questions for each other? Because you also probably know a little bit more about what the other one. So, did any of what the other person said make you think of a question that maybe we haven't had asked? And my other one is, if you were just generally like someone just came up to you and told you about a new technology that they thought was great in this area, what would your first questions be to try and make up your own mind about a technology?
That's a cool question. I would try to understand firstly how it like how it works, how it really works. So like, where does the energy come from? Where does the carbon or whatever other like materials come from? How are they converted or manipulated? Like what are the mechanisms? Um, and once that's clear, what are the limiting factors? If this works at a given efficiency, why is that the efficiency? And are those constraints things that are like foundational constraints, or are they constraints that could be alleviated by engineering? Um, and I think it's always really important to think of what a technology can be in principle rather than what it is now, and always to make sure to compare technologies fairly, like in the future. So if there's like a given competitor and you're like, well, I can develop my technology in, after 10 years of development, I think my thing can be better than this competitor. You have to compare your technology to that competitor in the future, after it has also undergone 10 years of development, right? So I think really thinking in terms of like, in principle, what's possible, and then what's limiting that possibility, both for your own technology and what you're comparing to, is, yeah, really important. That's the kind of questions I try to ask.
You were saying you might not be familiar with some of the specific technologies, but maybe just as someone that has this kind of like background, and you spent a lot of time watching, your questions might be slightly different to Paul. So what would your questions be? Would be someone said like, they have the answer to, all these questions, which I hope no one does because we're going to be very skeptical.
I mean, skepticism, right? That's the first thing that's going to pop into someone's mind. But also, I would want to then like after you understand a little bit of the technology and what they're trying to do, but also start questioning about, what are the long-term effects? Have you considered what, if it requires transportation, how are you going to offset the carbon output that comes from transporting one thing from one place to another? Is where you're creating this technology actually applicable to the area, or does it then have to be transported to somewhere else in order for it to actually be deployed? And so it kind of comes back to this like regional conversation too. It's like, is it actually aiding the area where it's being created, or is it just going to end up being net neutral ultimately at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's really interesting, kind of considering the bigger picture of it all and not just the very specific technology. And then when you talk about limitations, Paul, I'm guessing that particularly if you're going to be like an investor in a technology, for example, you would consider how is the either the public perception or acceptability or is going to, be a big factor in deciding whether to invest. So at what stage in the technology development are you kind of seeing that come in?
I am not the right person to ask
Versus
that
that.
question. I'm sorry. I usually live in a world of like foundational tech challenges, and the questions of public acceptance and stuff are not at all my expertise.
Yeah.
I could maybe speak towards that a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, Public acceptance is hard, right? Especially when we've had decades of saying, some things are bad, some things are good. But the thing that I found that like really, and like most communities, most bio-based communities need to really do a better job at is science communication and explaining, what the technology is in layman's terms so that, it feels like that they are a part of the solution, versus like it's going to harm them in some sort of way. And so using those types of tactics can be really helpful in bringing people along in the process. And also to that end, making sure that you have the full value chain represented as we're having conversations like this one. And it kind of plays back to the previous question that we had earlier on in this conversation about who's missing here. So, like, we can make all the assumptions that we want, but we won't know at the end of the day how the public feels about it until we bring everybody into the discourse.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to give you a minute each if you have any final thoughts before we wrap up. And we've also just for the audience, we've just put together a little like 2 questions that basically just for us to get a sense of basically what was interesting to you, what some of the other topics that you'd like to hear about as we continue to like try to put together a series of webinars that kind of keeps on moving the conversation forward. So if you take a moment at the end to just answer those questions, we'll keep the Zoom online so you can do that. But yeah, Paul, any closing thoughts for you? Anything you want people in the audience to kind of take away from today?
Um, yeah, I think I would just restate my a couple points I made on one being problem focused. And that and problem focused culture as being a way to bring people together from different perspectives who all care about a common problem. Um, and the second would be to make sure um, that you are considering the factors of scaling and technoeconomics in technologies that you're dealing with. And if you don't feel prepared to handle those questions on your own, to reach out to people who might be able to help you, because that's really, really crucial part of any technology, at least anything that has to, work at the commodity scale. Um, and oh, I had one. Oh, yeah, and the final thing would be to really dig into the foundational principles of a technology, what the constraints are, and where you think those constraints could be improved, and to make sure that you think about your technology that way, as well as your competitors' technologies, to imagine like what will be scalable in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Nazish?
Yeah, I completely agree with Paul's points just now. But in addition to that, I would also encourage people to also think beyond the technology at the same time. It's hard to do both things at once, but it's necessary. Because like if and when the technology is viable and it's scalable, those next hurdles are going to come up significantly fast. And having answers, or at least ideas on how to get answers, is going to be really beneficial to getting this out there. In addition to that, I think just continued conversations around this topic and how they do intersect with the bioeconomy and biotechnology at large, bring in different value chain people within the conversations. It's so important. And you don't realize the more we talk about it, the more people will understand the sector, but it also brings more people into the community, which is desperately what we need.
Thanks so much, Nazish and Paul. And just for me, just some closing remarks. First of all, thanks a lot to Nazish and Paul for joining us here today and sharing some of these aspects. And we continue for us at Connecting Genetics to Climate Learning, as we call it, learning in public. But the other thing is we are really interested in kind of having those dialogues with different people. We're considering different communities, but we also want to be able to kind of trial out having those conversations about specific technology. So if you're a scientist that is developing a technology and you think it has a local application or something, and you would like someone to partner with you in kind of like engaging with a local community, we'd love to talk to you. And the recording for this will be available on our website, so we'll share it once this is over. And do feel free to share it, and do let us know what other things you'd like to hear about, because we'll try to kind of keep on broadening the conversation. So thanks so much, and yeah, hopefully we'll keep on seeing each other in virtual or in-person spaces in some way. Thanks again, and join me in thanking the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.